co-host. All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm really excited about today's seminar hosted by the Department of Forest Resources here at the University of Minnesota. I'm Eli Sagor, an extension specialist based up at the Cloquet Forestry Center. And this is our third presentation in the series for this spring. We've had a couple of other talks, one exploring from a different angle, the use of fire, well, the Pagami Creek wildfire that happened just over 10 years ago with Aaron Kenya. And we heard from Kraus and Kyle Gill about gender identity and expression in natural resources. And today we've got Kurt Kipfmueller, who came all the way across campus from the Department of Geography. We're really glad to have him here for an in-person presentation. Welcome to all of you also who are joining us via Zoom. Kurt is from Central Michigan. He has degrees from the University of Arizona, University of Wyoming, and Central Michigan. He lives in St. Paul, and he's going to be talking to us today about some of the really fascinating work that he and his team have done exploring human and ecological histories as evidenced by dendrochronology and the stories that tree rings can tell us. Kurt, the screen and the floor are yours. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Eli. Thanks for having me. Just for the people that are online, I'm going to point some things out on the slide, and I'm going to try to remember to walk over and use my mouse to do it. If you need something pointed out, Eli's monitoring the chat, I think. And so Eli will cue me in and hopefully tell me that I need to fix something. Definitely. So that'll work. So thanks for coming, I guess, virtually or otherwise. It's actually the first time I've given a talk, I think, on campus to an audience in a while. So this will be interesting. So bear with me as we go. I know that the title looks a little different than the title that was probably sent out, but that's sort of related to how I've been thinking lately in terms of things just shift from one moment to the next. And I thought I'd actually take a little bit of a step back and tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from to give you a sense of why I'm talking about the things I'm talking about in the way that I'm talking about them. So I called it Reconciling Western Notions of Fire History in the Upper Great Lakes, my 30-year evolution of fire history thinking. That's after I changed it from Western baggage, because I wanted to kind of point out that I'm carrying a lot of things from being a Western scientist, having worked out west, and thinking through things a little bit differently. I changed it because it seemed a little bit better to be reconciling. So before I start, I just want to acknowledge that most of the work that I'm going to be talking about, I'm not just going to be talking about boundary waters, but much of the work that I'm going to be talking about has been done on traditional tribal landscapes. We work and live on traditional tribal landscapes here in the Twin Cities, and I want to make sure that I'm acknowledging that fact. Our goal in most of our work is to try to begin to understand how forests have changed, but also to understand how people have influenced that change and stewarded that change through time. So we've worked with a lot of different groups. I think I have almost everything up here, but our aim is really to try to begin conversations about how we think through fire, how we think through the future of fire in Minnesota, but also how past fire operated. So I also want to acknowledge that, so this is a card full of wood samples. I am the only person up here talking. There's no way that this work that I'm going to present is done by one person. Countless undergraduates, former and current, countless graduate students, former and current, people from different communities, different agencies have all contributed in different ways to this project. So I'm sort of just a representative figurehead, kind of. I'm going to hopefully channel some of the things that I've talked about with other people as we go along, but I want to make sure that everybody understands this is not me. This is a much broader effort. I'm going to start out talking a little bit about me, but the efforts that have gone into developing this data set and these data sets that I'm going to talk about are pretty big, and they've involved a lot of people over time. So I'll talk a little bit about where I'm coming from and a little bit about the baggage that I brought along. I can't really do a fire talk in Minnesota without at least talking a little bit about Myron Heinzelman, Bud Heinzelman. And so I'll spend just a touch of time on that. And then I'm going to remind everybody of what we know about the boundary waters from, I think, a lot of the talks that have been given over time. So I don't want to spend a ton of time on that. But there are a couple things we haven't talked about that I want to point out. And then finally, I'm going to mention some fire history patterns other places, sort of in an effort to try to reflect some different patterns. The things that we see in the boundary waters, how well do they work outside the boundary waters? So to start off, I have been doing fire history work since, I think the first sample I ever collected was in 1995 in the Medicine Bow Root National Forest in southeastern Wyoming. From there, I worked at high elevations in very, very simple stands of lodgepole pine for the most part, older stands had spruce and fir, but pretty simple forests. From there, I began my PhD work in Montana, and I worked at high elevations again, simple landscapes, large wilderness areas or de facto wilderness areas, if nothing else. But these are landscapes that are largely, I'm going to say this now, and I'm going to correct myself later, but when we first walked into these landscapes, we would have said, we are removing the human impact here in terms of trying to understand fire patterns by going to large wilderness areas that only burn infrequently. So the human impact at that point in time was thought to be fire suppression, and it was, but it hadn't really had an influence on these really, really high elevation systems that only burn every couple hundred years. They're drought-driven fire regimes, and I'll get to that again, and they really didn't have much suppression influence. This is just to notice, that's me, much younger. It's really to illustrate that the best way to sample trees is to find somebody bigger than you that can work the other end of the crosscut saw, and I've tried to do that throughout my career. It hasn't always worked, but that's an effort. So I use this diagram, I haven't used it in a while, I had to dig it up, and it was on a server, I couldn't find it, to sort of represent how fires operate in a really, really simplistic sort of sense. So if you think about fire frequency along the bottom, the x-axis, this fire frequency x-axis, we have fires more often on the left, less often on the right, and this is developed for undergrads from a 1,000 level class. So this is pretty simple to follow. If you follow this line, fire frequency becomes less and less often as you go higher in elevation or higher latitude, but on this other y-axis, we have fire severity. So we have low severity fires in the lower left, high frequency, low severity. On the upper right, we have high severity, low frequency fires. So they don't happen a lot, but when they do, they're standard placing and catastrophic. And I tended to operate over in here for the first decade of my fire history work. So where fires were very infrequent, they were controlled by climatic patterns largely, they were climate controlled, weather controlled, you got a fire every 100 or so years. And I've never shown this slide outside of my dissertation presentation, I don't think. And I thought it'd be a really nice opportunity to do a little bit of a throwback for me, because I'm going to wax nostalgic for a second. There's a lot of information in here. You don't need to know any of it. It all says the same thing. And it all basically says that large fires burned when it was really dry. And so after you go out and spend 7 years collecting fire history data at high elevations, and you find out that large fires burn when it's dry, you sort of throw up your hands, you're like, why did I just spend all that time doing that? It seemed a little bit ridiculous. That said, this shaped my understanding of fire. Like it or not, I was very, very much focused on understanding the relationship between fire and the physical environment, those controls that are from the physical environment. And part of that stems from my work in wilderness areas. We worked on this project in Stony River Wilderness Area, largely to remove people as an influence on the fire regime, to try to separate out what we would call the noise from the system. When I came to Minnesota, well, that meant I carried a lot of baggage. And so this is my representation of baggage, my backpack with a very large sample on it. It's that thick for a reason. And then backpack parking, so I parked my backpack. So I have baggage in 2 respects. One, in that I have geographic baggage. I worked out west. I was trained out west. And so I worked in an area where there's a very, very close, very, very tight connection between fire occurrence and climate. You get a lot of dry lightning storms. You get these big fires, low elevation and high elevation, and when it's dry, it burns. Very tight connection. more complicated than that, but that's the basic gist. So I also carry a lot of baggage just from my training. I was trained in a natural sciences setting to try to think about what the natural processes were that controlled fire on the landscape. And this is a product of the time to a certain extent too, because at the time that I was working on my master's work and my dissertation work, we were really trying to understand what the future was going to look like under a new climatic regime. We didn't really know how large fire events and high elevations were going to react. So we were trying to remove some of the noise, and some of that noise wasn't argued at that point in time people. We wanted to get at what I'm going to put in air quotes now, the natural fire regime. So I also learned how to do the work I did from a statistical standpoint. So I know the statistics of fire history pretty well. That said, there's a lot you can learn from studying different systems. So when I came to Minnesota, and I grew up in Michigan, so this is me and my twin brother in 1973, I think, 1981. This is me my second year here at the University of Minnesota. I can't find the first year. I had already blocked that out, I guess. So I went to Central Michigan University. I grew up in Michigan, and I went out west for a long time. And I learned most of what I learned out west. But I'd spent a lot of time in Michigan forests. I spent a lot of time in Great Lakes forests. I thought that I knew those forests pretty well. And so when I came back here, I thought that I was going to be able to just drop back into the system that I grew up with and apply what I learned out west to this particular system. And when I got here, one of the first things that anybody talked to me about when I inquired about doing fire history was, well, it's already all been done, you know. And I will just point out, this is the very first paper I ever read as a graduate student. It was assigned by my graduate advisor before I started my master's work. And the idea is that all of the work in the boundary waters have been done, and that represented the landscape as we knew it, and that represented fire. Before I go too far, I just want you to know I'm not in any way, I want to make sure you understand that the work that Bob Heisselman did was phenomenal. Okay? So my work and our work as a group doesn't denigrate that at all. Okay? It works like classic science should. We're simply moving forward, building on somebody else's ideas. And that's what we're doing. So I've often been stopped, and after talks, it's like, wow, you guys are really pushing it on the Heisselman ideas. That's not it at all. We're trying to add to our understanding, and I want to make sure everyone knows that. But nevertheless, when you step into Minnesota and you want to do fire history, there's some pretty big shoes to fill, or even follow it. And I mean, fire-dependent forests, standard placing fires, fire deficit, climate drift, these are all things that Huntsman hit in 1973, and they're all things we talk about now still, 50 years later, or almost 50 years later. So I want to just point out that, so Bud did a lot of the fire history work in the boundary waters. He did it in a different way, and he did it for a different reason. These are some of Bud's original fire scarred samples that were collected. There aren't very many of them remaining. He didn't collect many in the first place. He was after these large fires that occurred very infrequently or relatively infrequently across the landscape to try to show that fire was an important process in these forests. So he basically collected a few fire scars to get dates, but by and large, his primary effort was based off of reconstructing fire patterns by pouring trees and looking at stand regeneration in ages. So these are some of his field notes, and you can see, I think I actually highlighted them. You can see that he's doing the calculations while he's in the field. He's actually hand counting cores in the field. Some he would bring back with him, but then he's doing the math and he's trying to figure this out. Like 1965, when it was sampled, 140 rings, 1825. That's probably 1822. Down here, probably 1822 fire. All of these things were his effort in trying to get at what the fire history was on the landscape, kind of at a coarse scale, I would say. And if you look at the scale that he worked at, it's phenomenal. Coupling field data with aerial photos to map out stand origin dates was a big deal, and it still is a big deal. However, part of my Western baggage, because I was at a particular place in the West that did very particular types of fire history work, because these dates were not exact and had not been cross-dated, it was never really thought to be all that were, I don't know, that's probably too strong of a word. But we knew that there were still some areas we could probably improve on if we wanted to understand the fire-climate relationship. And I'll just point out here, so this is a fire history chart. So each one of these red diamonds represents a fire event that occurred on the landscape. The horizontal lines, you're going to see a bunch of these. The horizontal lines represent tree age, the age at which these trees covered. And these are labeled at the top for the fires that scarred more than one tree, I think, in this particular stand. This is from this little point over here. And you can see that the Heinzelman map, most of this is 1864. There's a 1967 fire, there's an 1894 fire, there's an 1894 fire. We collected a pretty good evidence of 1865 fire, and then a whole bunch of other fires. So it's a different scale of work. The work we went out and did looks at data somewhat differently. So there's still a lot of area for us to improve on, I think. Nevertheless, Bud's work formed a lot of our understanding of fire regimes in the Great Lakes, especially with red and white pine forests. And many papers came out using these dates to simulate landscapes to look at how the shifting mosaic out of it, to get an idea of how things went. That, rightly or wrongly, that paradigm was established by Bud, was carried through for 40 years. The idea that the boreal forest had large standard placing fires, and that's what the fire regime was, and those are the most important parts. The Pagami Creek type fires. Those are natural events, they're normal, they're a part of the landscape. We shouldn't worry about it. But what Bud also said is that finally, in addition to the large birds, there certainly were hundreds of creeping surface fires that scarred a few trees, if any. All traces of such fires are already gone, even fires of the 20th century. So he's explicitly acknowledging that there were these surface fires that were there, but he didn't necessarily focus on those as part of his work. The other thing that Bob pointed out, and this is in the foreword, the journal, the special issue that this paper was, the 73 paper was in, is that we need to understand more thoroughly the relative roles of lightning and man as fire factors in the primeval system. The key question is whether lightning alone is an adequate source of ignition to account for the observed extent of burning in given ecosystems. This is important. It actually starts to get at this idea, and this is Bud thinking about what his fire history looked like. Is there enough lightning to drive the system that he was studying? And his system has many fewer fires than the system that I'm going to show you. Okay, so in 2006, I had to dig deep for these. So in 2006, we actually collected our first fire scarred sample in Ram's Head Lake. And it's this piece of garbage sample. I'm sorry if Evan or Lane is on this right now, but it's not a great sample. But we found a fire scarred stump and we cut it to see basically what would happen and what it would look like. Around that same time, I had started thinking about fire in this particular landscape in the Great Lakes, thinking about a way in which I could move forward with understanding where Bud left off. And so I have notes for an NSF career proposal, which never got submitted. And I have notes for a fire climatology study in red pine forest from 2006. Those went by the wayside because they got dragged out west to keep doing work out west. And I put them aside and I never thought about them again until a little later. In 2010 sometime, Lane Johnson came up to visit my lab and he said something along these lines. I should have recorded it, I wish I could have. He asked me, he told me he wanted to do fire history in the boundary waters. He worked as an archaeologist in the summer and he wanted to see what the imprint or what the relationship was between Native American burning and fires along the border route in the boundary waters. And I replied to him, you can easily develop a fire history in the boundary waters. Whether you are able to separate lightning and people is another matter altogether. I was skeptical from the get-go. And I said, yeah, it's great. We can do a fire history. We cross-date it, we can compare it to climate. It's going to be awesome. We might not be able to get at the people part, but we can try. Sure, I'll humor you. This is Lane, who's about 13. So we kind of set this up. And this is where we started to do some work. Lane's master's work really started us off in a very narrow, or very small part of Lac La Croix. we went on and did basically a pilot study. There's master's thesis, a pilot study that had 78 fire-scarred trees, so a lot. From there, we also went in and did some work in Voyageurs National Park while we started thinking about how we would work in the boundary waters. As we did this, we were sampling and collecting fire history just to get an idea of how possible this was. So we set this up as a series of sort of assumptions, or maybe the questions we should be asking, or the patterns we might be able to see. And there are 4 that I'm going to talk about. There are a lot more assumptions in this. But one is we should see more fire in places where people were located. That has to assume that people were lighting fires. We should see less synchrony among fire events. That has to assume that climate controls synchrony. We should also see weaker fire-climate relationships. You can see where, when I read these things, I can see where my influences were. Weaker fire-climate relationships assumes people only burn when this is dry and lightning only affects fires when climate is prepared fuels. This is like me hedging my bets. Like, well, yeah, we got to assume this, this, and this. And we should also see shorter fire intervals where people are located, and that follows from having more fires. So basically, the idea is what is the role of, what are the roles of people in these landscapes versus what are the roles of lightning? So I'm going to use the word natural here, and I'll probably come back to it. What's natural? What's human caused? What's anthropogenic? And that started a series of projects. We started working in the boundary waters. Since then, we've worked in a lot of other areas as well. So Voyageurs National Park, Star Island and Cass Lake. We have some work in Lake Itasca. I'm going to talk about both of these a little bit. We also have a couple of other sites down in here. Maybe a site on the west side of Winnebagoshus. We are working in Cloquet because people are in Cloquet. We've done some work in the Boyd Rule, the Apostles, and I've done some work in Michigan, which I'll get on a little bit. So we started to build this network, and we wanted to build a network so we could get an idea of what the landscape of fire looked like. And this is kind of what it looks like. And so I wanted to bring this up now just so everybody's aware that this is 59 regions or sites. We kind of go back and forth, different places on the landscape. A lot of these are in the boundary waters, but they're not all. It basically tells us that there's a lot of fire. Like, that's it. There's a lot of fire. Like, you can go home. Like, that's really from some standpoints, you could just say a lot of fire, time to go home. So this is regions, these are samples. About 600 samples of this particular thing, but a lot. The really important part, or one of the important parts I think is worth focusing on, and my clicker is going to click me back and forth here, is that we actually have a pretty good idea of how frequently fires burn. So this is the intervals between adjacent fires, so the blue lines. The red is the time since the last fire, if we use 2015 as a cutoff date. And so what you can see is that the time between these fires is much, much shorter. The lion's share of them are between 10 and 14 years. But we're now operating out in here with very, very long fire intervals. That has implications for what the landscape looks like. It has implications for how we restore landscapes. It has implications for how we reapply fire or fire surrogates to the landscape. Okay, so boundary waters. I'm going to try to move through some of these pretty quickly. But the boundary waters, most people here know. I don't have to talk about it. It's a large wilderness area. It was also a very important travel corridor. We went to the boundary waters because, let's be realistic, we wanted to go to the boundary waters. That's probably about half the story. We went to the boundary waters because it was a place where we knew people operated. There was a good archaeological record, and we knew that people were traveling along the border route, and we knew that that was where use was going to be concentrated. We could set up a hypothesis that if people burn, they're probably going to burn where they are located. And if people are traveling on the border route, that's probably where people are going to be located. So we set it up so that we would sample on-route sites and off-route sites. I'm going to come back to this map in a little bit. And this is what our sort of sampling regime ended up looking like. So all of the blue lakes are lakes that we've paddled. Somebody paddled those. Mostly it was probably Lane. Secondarily, it's probably Evan, because if there were 3 of us, I rode in canoe. I'm not as good at paddling as other people are. That said, I did my share of paddling and my share of paddling. Anything gray we didn't look at. You can see the primary forest. You can see the locations of culturally modified trees. But we have samples throughout the boundary waters where we can find them. So we have this on-route, off-route setup where we had some sites on-route, some sites off-route. And when you separate those out in terms of fire history, you can see a pretty stark difference. So we have a number or quite a few fires at the on-route sites and less fires at the off-route sites. I'll come back to this because there are some things that make me a little uncomfortable from a statistical side that I'll get to. So when you look at something like this, it becomes immediately evident in some ways that there's a lot more fire at on-route sites, exactly what you would expect. If people are present, they're burning more, there you're done. We know that there are people there, we know that they were probably burning for a variety of different reasons, and there's more fire there. At off-route sites, fewer people, fewer fire. I'm interested in synchrony. One of the things that really bugged me about that entire data set is that there's not a lot of synchrony. So this is just the proportion of sites that were burned over time. And this dashed line is what I learned was our notion of widespread fires. If 25% of your samples burn or record fire, and if 25% of your sites burn, it's a widespread synchronous fire. If we took that tact or that approach in the boundary waters, we get 168081, it's actually 808182, depending on where you're at. And we get 1739, and that's it. Nothing else is synchronous. There's no synchrony. Well, this helps us in some ways. I shouldn't say helps us, but it lends some credence to the idea that, well, we wouldn't expect synchronous fires because, you know, people weren't burning everything. They were burning here and there. So we shouldn't see synchrony. So, but it's pretty hard to investigate synchrony when you just don't have it. And that's a problem for some of us. So there's the people side, right? But there's also the fact that this is what the boundary waters looks like. It's possibly not synchronous because the landscape's disconnected. So a fire might start on an island and burn over another island, but that doesn't happen every time. You have to have the right conditions, the right wind speeds, the right winds, the right fuel conditions. It's a 1 in a million shot, right? It's hard to do that. So that asynchrony that we see could be related to people or it could be related to landscape. If we think about synchrony in a slightly different way, whoops, sorry, I'll go back one more. When you break it down by site, these are just a number of sites, you actually see quite a bit of synchrony within this actual stands themselves. So even if you don't see landscape scale synchrony, you do end up seeing a lot of synchrony within a site. So if an island caught on fire, the whole thing burned. If a small peninsula caught on fire, the whole thing burned. It didn't mean that the islands right next door to each other would burn, but there's a lot of synchrony on the ground, and that becomes important later on. Okay, so for my own edification, because I do like fire climate stuff, this will be my rapid fire climate explanation. So this is what we call a superposed epoch analysis. It's basically a compositing technique where you collapse all the fires into 1 year, and then you compare the climate data around. It's kind of a sophisticated technique, but it's really easy to figure out. If the bar is going down, that means that there's a departure, actual minus simulated, because there's a big simulation that goes on behind this, in terms of the Palmer drought severity index. Basically, what this is saying is that the bar that goes downward is that it's dry, okay? So again, over here we have fires that occur only at on-route sites. This is the place that you would see most of the human influence. All the way over here, you have fires that occur both on-route and off-route and burned a bunch of landscapes, more than 4 sites. So these are the least climate influenced, these are the most, and it's exactly what you would see. You see almost a very limited influence of climate over here where humans are active or are actively burning, possibly. And over here you see a much, much stronger climatic effect. The interesting one to me is this one. So basically these are years. So the 0 year is the event year. -1 is 1 year before, -2 years, 2 years before, and 1 year after. I think that what this is telling us is that when off-route sites burn, not only was it dry during the fire year, but it actually was embedded within a longer term drought period. So it's not just 1 year that's dry, but usually it's probably following somewhere within a 2 year dry period. There's some other ways to tease that out. Okay, back to the synchrony issue. So one of the problems I've always had with this is that when you take all of these samples, 414 samples, and you collapse them into 101 sites, and then you split it into 32 and 69 on-route, 32 off-route, you lose a lot of stuff. And one of the things you lose is actually some of the temporal resolution that I think is really, really important. And we've always been puzzled by this little reduction in fire between 1800 and about 1850. Well, if you remember these 2 border routes, we have the north route that goes through Canada, Cam Dog route, and we have a southern route that basically goes along the border. That's why we call it the border route. But the border route actually stopped in about 1802. It stopped being used. So you can actually think about this now and think, all right, well, if the route shifted from here to here, would you see a change in the fire history at those sites? If people are the principal source of fire activity, you should see that. Well, when you break it out at all the sites, you don't really see it. But if you look at the actual data from a site-to-site standpoint, which we do not ever hardly do, you can actually see some pretty big gaps all the way through. This is different, and I'll get to that. But you see these big gaps that start and end at various times all along the border route, which to me is pretty strong circumstantial evidence that might suggest that there's a tangible human component to this fire regime. Okay. But backing up, there are sites along the border route that do not have a fire hiatus. And this, I just happen to have this slide on hand for something else, but it served its purpose. The site that I showed were up there before that had a bunch of fires through that 1800s period, that's probably a site that was occupied for a much, much longer period of time. It's the term persistent places. I think I'm stealing that term from Lane or possibly Sean Dunham, I can't remember, but places that were used over and over again that were really, really important. These places are not necessarily on or off route, they're just somewhere up there. So some of these places were places that whether or not there were people traveling along the border route, it didn't matter because they were being used for other things as well. It wasn't just to be on the border route. So that helps explain why there's some variability from one place to the next. On the whole, there's reduced fires between about 1800 and about 1850. However, there are particular places that did continue burning throughout the time period. Okay, which brings me to my challenge, or not my challenge, but my discomfort. So I've always been bothered by the disparate numbers at on-route and off-route sites. We have more than twice as many on-route sites, okay? And so this is a picture, there's a series of pictures like this of me and Evan having a friendly conversation about how we address this. It was something that both of us approached in using kind of a different ways of thinking and working things through. My way of working things through meant that we had to go for a walk around the island in opposite directions until we came back together and could agree on something. So this is my symbol of sometimes you have to really have important conversations about how processes work or how you interpret things in order to understand each other and where people are coming from. Because I was so uncomfortable with the on-route, off-route thing, and here's why. So this is our cumulative number of fire events at on-route sites, and this is the cumulative number of unique fire events at off-route sites. You can see a huge difference. So there's different numbers of unique fire years, but there's no difference between the sites in terms of the statistical relationship of the actual intervals. So where you have fires at off-route sites, the intervals are actually just about the same. There's a little bit of a difference, but statistically they're the same. So to convince myself that these were real, I built, well, and I can explain a little bit. As you add, anybody that's done any kind of biogeography or ecology knows that as you collect more samples, you get more things. As you look at larger areas, you get more species. As you collect more samples, as you collect more sites, you necessarily collect more fire intervals and fire dates, which is exactly what this is showing. So we have fire events on the left, we have mean fire interval on the right, which is a terrible statistic. The circle size is related to the size of the number of fire scars that actually go into each site. And what you see is what you would expect. If you have a lot of samples at a site, you have a lot of fire events and that tails off. It doesn't always hold. Sometimes you have not very many samples, but still get a lot of fire events. Some trees actually capture everything. But in general, this is what makes fire historians uncomfortable. And this is what made me uncomfortable. So I built a model because that's what I like to do. And my model basically threw everything together and tested 1,000 times by randomly drawing out the same size of samples on route and off route, but just randomly making the assumption that everything was equal to see how often I would get coincident fire events, unique fire years, and intervals that match. And the answer to that is basically never. you never get what was observed. So this is the observed difference between on route and off route number of fire events. Over 1,000 iterations, you never have a difference this large. So to me, that's pretty convincing. This, on the other hand, is maybe more problematic. So I just wanted to simply take a side note and say that you can have an over-reliance on statistical approaches, and that can sometimes obscure important patterns. And this is sort of the Occam's razor right here. The simplest explanation is oftentimes the best. If you have as many fires as you're seeing in a particular place, and you don't really get that many lightning fires, something has to be starting those fires, and it's probably not squirrels running around. It's probably something else. Okay, so I've always asked this question, that if we could actually go out and find a whole bunch more sites off route, would that change our story? And I struggle with this because this is not a lack of sampling yet. There just aren't more sites off route. There's fewer sites off route. So I don't think we ever could do that. But if we could, would it change the story? And I simply would just say, I would say maybe. I think that off route sites look a lot like the on route sites in terms of the intervals. And I think adding fire start data or adding additional sites isn't going to change that. On route sites, we have plenty, we don't need any more. But I think we would end up with more fire years, but the same intervals. Doesn't really change the story. It just gives us more intervals to work with. Okay, so let me just step away from that for a second. So that's the quick boundary layer stuff. If you go to another spot, because my discomfort with a lot of this is the boundary waters is a very unique landscape. And I'm not so sure the boundary waters is representative of the larger whole. At least today, maybe in the past it was. And so I want to talk just really briefly about Star Island, which is in Cass Lake. Gamswakagat is the place for the red cedar. We're working with tribal groups, Leech Lake, the Leech Lake Band, the Chippewa National Forest, Lane Johnson and myself, to try to have a respectful conversation around fire. This is cabin country. They're all docks along the island. This was at one point in time, it was a Windows Village site. And we went and collected fire history samples all over the western side, kind of basically over here, to try to get a sense of how often this place burned. We also have some work going on at Itasca, and that work's being done by one of my graduate students. And I wanted to just mention this really quickly, because we have 20 sites and 128 samples situated across the park. And this is important, because this has actually been examined in much the same way that Heinzelman's work was examined. But we've kind of gone back to look at it again. So if you look at that particular landscape, so Star Island on the top and Itasca State Park on the bottom, first of all, you see very, very short intervals. So when the island burned, almost the whole thing burned. The interesting thing is Itasca State Park, when one part of the park burned, almost the whole park burned. These are 20 sites that are scattered across the park, and they're all reporting the same fires. You probably wouldn't expect that. It's a large area. There's lots of breaks in there, but it is. It's burning almost all the park is burning every single time we got a fire. So again, Occam's razor, when we have this many small fires in this particular landscape over 8, 9, 10 years, the odds of it being just chance lightning strikes is pretty small, I would think. I don't know that much about fire fuels, or forest fuels. So let me go to one other place. So the Brule River Portage, I'll go back real quick just to highlight this. So the Brule River Portage is actually the portage between basically Lake Superior and the Mississippi Basin. It was used heavily from the mid-1600s to the mid-1800s. So we have a fire history there as well. If you look at that fire history, it has a totally different time period of representation. It goes back further. There's lots of fires, just tons of fires. This is about a 1.5 mile stretch of trail, not very long. Mostly right along the edge of the trail. It's very steep off the one side. You get lots and lots of fire throughout the entire record till about 1847, which coincidentally is about the time the fur trade ended. All right, about the time the fur trade collapsed. So my point to all of this is just to say that there's lots of different types of evidence out there that actually tells us a lot about how fires operate on the landscape. that start to point at people as being really, really important with respect to their use of the landscape for different purposes. Whether it's clearing travel corridors, whether it's trying to tend blueberries, whether it's trying to just make your forest more open so you can see things through the forest, there's lots and lots of reasons. It seems like after being on the land for a long, long period of time, it would have been figured out that fire was an important tool that should be used. I feel like now, as a fire historian, like saying that, it almost seems silly. Because of course, here we are right now trying to think about how we're going to use fire as a tool when fire was used to restore forests back to what they looked like in the early 1900s. When fire was used as a tool for exactly that sort of land tending a long time ago, and you just seem to have ignored or forgotten or insert whatever word you want into that. We have lots of evidence. So it's the timing. It's the number of fires, excuse me, the timing, the number of fires, the number of events. All of these things kind of come into play and add multiple lines of evidence. I'm going to slide through this next one really, really quickly. I think I've talked a little bit about it, if I haven't, Lynn hasn't, but from a restoration standpoint, understanding the timing of fires is really, really important because it helps us to understand how often we should be putting fires on the landscape. For me, the cool thing about this is that we have age at first scar. So how old is a tree when it first gets burned? The intervals between adjacent fires. So I consider this to be like, this is a maintenance interval, this is a survivorship interval, and this is a loss of fire interval. And you can use these sorts of things as important tools. Okay, all right. Those are all places we know, they're all places we know where people were, so we kind of biased our sample set, right? We said, oh, let's go where we know people were. It's not exactly what happened, but that's sort of the way we can kind of think about it. So what if you go to places you don't know anything about? And I did. So I grew up in a landscape in the center of the Lower Peninsula of Michigan. I'm a geographer. It's shameful I don't have a map, but I do have a map on me. It's like right here. And it's on the interior. I'll show it this way. It's on the interior of the Lower Peninsula. And we don't really have a strong history of understanding how different lifeways work in this particular landscape because we make the assumption, when I say we, I mean myself as a white Western scientist. We made the assumption that the coastal areas are the most heavily used. So I've walked the woods around my place for a long, long time. It's in Fife Lake Township. And I've been looking at the GLO notes. If you read the GLO notes, and I'll translate it because it's really hard to read, it says, this is a beautiful township for survey, which is the only claim to attention it has. Basically, this place is totally open. We can kill this place fast. We can survey it so quick because we don't have to shoot around trees. There's no trees. It's the only claim to attention it has. It's principally pine barrens and plains, and what is not so soon will be with very frequent recurrences of fire, which is now almost entirely destroyed the timber of any valley. So in other words, this is a landscape that got burned a lot. These are two fire-scarred cross sections from that particular landscape. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think there's a seventh in here. There's one there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 on this one. That's a lot of fire. Okay. I've lived there my whole life. It's been one fire in 50 years, and it was not like those. So there's strong circumstantial evidence to suggest that there are particular places on the landscape that we know about, but there are probably a lot of places that we haven't looked at. So just to kind of wrap up. So evidence of fire is really all over the place. We see it on fire-scarred trees, it's Lake 13. And it's probably evidence of fire stewardship at the same time as it is evidence of license. That's an important distinction. I don't think we've been looking at it quite right, or I don't think we've been looking for it diligently enough. And my PhD advisor, Tom Sweatman, always used to say, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. And I can't help but trying to think back to some of the things that people have said to me, like, there isn't a record of Native American use, no artifacts, no known record, no history, so it can't be Native American fire use. I just think that that's really dismissive. And I think that we need to be thinking about the landscape somewhat differently. And so I say it might be time for us to change our base assumptions. And what I mean by that is maybe we should be approaching Red pine forest in particular is forest that we automatically make the assumption that they were managed, intended for particular reasons at particular times, that they were managed intentionally and with some level of care. Rather than saying, this place burned, prove it that it was burned by people. Instead, let's try to figure out what those particular dynamics were. So I also want to point out that I'm not saying that lightning is not an important ignition source or that climate doesn't matter. In fact, it matters a lot. So I actually think we ignore this too much because this to me is really cool. So these little circles, they're all the innermost ring, the tip of a tree. Okay, each one of these trees, the horizontal line. What they show is that there are very distinct cohorts within our records. There's only 238 here for voyagers and the boundary waters. We can do this with all the sites. That are probably large fires. They were probably burning during extremely dry conditions. They were probably standard placing in some places, not everywhere, because we have a lot of scars for fires as well. But this sort of tells me that there are climatic controls. It's not an either or proposition. It's a both and, right? Both are important. So what I am saying is that if you look at how much fire is on the landscape, it's awfully hard to show that that's lightning alone. We don't have good records of lightning strikes. We don't have great records of lightning fire, but I can tell you we probably have pretty good circumstantial evidence. I don't even want to say circumstantial, pretty good evidence to suggest that people have burned. So I want to wrap up just by saying I worry, because I worry about what we're in today. We have spent 100 years in a landscape that basically looks like this, that has a ton of fire, right? There's so much fire there, and it's been 100 years since these places have burned. They look different. They're full of fuels. On top of that, we're also now existing in a landscape that's going to be warmer, drier, and more extreme. And so right now, in the upper Great Lakes, things look okay. But if you look out west, what's out west is coming. So the western bag that I came with is on its way here. And if we wait too long, that could be problematic. So I like to think of what I do now as being kind of as an interpreter. And I'm trying to use trees to help you understand the stories that may have gone away or that have faded. So the Nagoka Cowan means the wisdom of the trees. One of my colleagues, Sean and Marcy, we talked about this idea. I can't remember if this is Marcy's term or if this is Sean's term, but what we're basically doing is above ground archaeology. We're really trying to figure out what sort of evidences are in the tree rings that help us understand the culture that was there tending the landscape before us. So I really feel strongly that we need to start moving past this common fire binary, this natural fire versus cultural fire, and start to really think about how we support Indigenous-led fire management that reflects the 200 years ago or 150 years ago, those past relationships that built up over time that involve land tenure. I think that's all I have, and I do, and if I have time for questions, I'm happy to take them.
Well, Kurt, thank you very much. That was really a great talk. A lot there. I have a quick question. I'll invite folks. There are more people watching online than in person. So those of you online, you can use the chat or the Q&A to post questions. We'll be watching for those. Kurt, a simple question that occurred to me as you were talking, why are there fewer sites off route? I would have thought most of the region would be off route. Why is that?
So we have our own, I'm going to give you my own ideas, but I think that so we're also working with stands of red pine, right? So you got to find red pine off route, right? Yeah. And so if there's no red pine and no stumps, there's nothing for us to sample, right? So that's part of it. I know that there have been discussions amongst our group about there's more southwest facing landscapes right on the border route than you find in the interior sections. And that actually is important from an adaptive standpoint to get red pine. The short answer is, I don't know if they just all got wiped out in 1964 fire. Some of it's definitely because there was a lot more logging in that particular part of the park. Part of it, I think, might actually have something to do with the connection between people and red pine, which I'm not actually kind of getting at. The thing that I can keep going back in my head, and I try not to say it out loud too often because I'm not really sure I have evidence to sort of show this. But the more I think about it, the more I think that okay, so red pine is a fire dependent species, right? It needs fire to propagate. It also needs really, really frequent fire to be able to maintain low competition, germinate seedlings, keep soil, mineral soil for germination. There's all kinds of reasons it needs it, but I don't know that without people, if you get a fire regime that would propagate red pine. So in particular places off route, they look like on route sites because they probably were used a lot and they had red pine. So I think that could be one of the reasons that those sites are there. Other people have different feelings about that. I don't think we have the right data yet to be able to go as far as saying red pine are people dependent because the fire regime is people dependent. I feel like we're getting close, and I feel like discussions with other people that I've worked with kind of are leaning that way, but we don't have the right data. I know I feel like that when I walk around in the woods around where I grew up, that it should all be red pine and it's oak. It's just oak, and it shouldn't be oak. I don't think. If you look at the survey records from 1839, it's not oak. So I think that that's part of it.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship with Leech Lake Band and the work at Star Island and thinking about the Chippewa? Because I feel like that's a place where there now is kind of a mandated MOU suggesting that we need to move into that Indigenous-led management. I'm curious about the relationship you've built and how this work is moving forward to support that shift in how forest is managed.
So that work started in February of 2020. It took a while for our funding to come through, and we got the funding in January, and our first meeting at the same exact day, they announced that Mike Pence was going to be the COVID czar. So that kind of we had done some field work together, but we hadn't actually got one. I really worried at that point what would happen. And I'm just going to, we started on Zoom. We had these Zoom conversations that were supposed to be a half an hour, 45 minutes, or an hour long, and an hour and a half and 2 hours long. It was a really, really fun exchange. And I'm probably not going to answer your question because it's kind of, I can tell already how I'm thinking. It's been interesting. It's been really, really nice to get out in the woods and just talk, right? And sometimes our discussions are about fire, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're discussions about a different plant. Sometimes they're discussions about the water. Sometimes they're different. There's just different discussions that go on. And so I guess the one thing I would say is that one of the things I didn't, I don't know if that's not the right way to put it, because I'm a pretty friendly person. But I guess I didn't really think about the value or the importance of building personal, trusting relationships with people that you want to work with in different ways. And it was a long process. We're still working together. We're not funded, but we're still working together. We're still have plans. Actually, the CHIP is actually funding us to do some things here and there. But we still go out and we still work together. It's really about having conversations more than anything else. And the information that we're collecting is helping to inform how often the place burned. The connection between us and actual on-the-ground management, that hasn't quite happened. That's what we're working on now. It's like, okay, now we know how frequent. Lake 13 is amazing. That little cross section that had like a whole bunch of fires after it, that's crazy. We have a site on Pine Point that has more fires than I've ever seen in my life. So I think we're starting to find these places that actually have lots of fire history. But now we're starting to think through like, all right, well, what does Indigenous-led fire management look like? This is happening in a lot of places, mostly in California, but how is it going to happen here? I'm not a firefighter. I'm not a fire. I'm not an active firefighter, or, which I think is a terrible term, first of all. But I think that we probably need to be thinking about how the tree rings can form that. But, you know, honestly, like, it's clear to me that the place burns so often that, like, you don't need me to tell you that, they don't need me to tell anybody, like, how often it burns. It's clear that it burns a lot.
Can I just follow
Yeah.
up on that? My relationship with one of the natural resource management foresters, who's like, he needs you to be able to cross that boundary with the national forest to say, hey, let them do this, and we can put our Western science that you want because you don't trust the Indigenous science to bat for what he wants to do.
And I would absolutely agree. And I would also say, I feel like that's happening. Like, I do feel like that's happening. Like, we've done lots of, like, gone up and done lunch and learns and things like that. And had just had people in the field. Like, there was one day where we had people from the tribal college, folks in the tribal college, folks in the band, folks in the CHIP, all at the same time, just talking. And that's the idea. Like, just talking and seeing what the data look like on the ground, on a stump. Oh, wow, there's 5 fires on that thing. It's only less than 100 years old. That's a lot of fire. That sort of stuff, yes, is important. And I do feel like those connections, I don't know if that's, I think that those connections are important between the Chippewa National Forest and the band. I feel like those are there to a certain extent, at least with the group I work with. Maybe I think that's where we have to go moving forward, yes. I do think it's important to say, look, there's a lot of fire, but I think people are starting to do that.
All right, now another question here. Many of the fire event figures show that there was a large increase in the number of fires in the mid-1700s. Is this an actual reflection of the number of fire events? And if so, why? Or is this simply a function of the persistence of these stumps over time? In other words, you can only find samples that go back so far in time.
So that's a really good question. It does increase, and it tends to increase right after the 1736 fire. And it goes up quite rapidly right after it. And it's not a function of sample, what we would call sample depth. There's plenty of stumps that go back through there, that go through that time period. It could very likely be a reflection of movement of people into the region and the use of fire at that particular time. We know, and this is, I'm trying to kind of paraphrasing and basing this on conversations with other people, but there's pretty strong evidence to see that kind of pinpoints time periods of when people were on the landscape at different times. And it seems like people that were interested in using fire were on the landscape at that particular time, but not necessarily before. It's a much more complicated story than that, but it's a real effect, and it's probably a human-related effect more than anything else. That said, there was a huge fire in 1680, and we're not really sure how far that fire went, because a lot of that evidence of the 1680 fire could have just been wiped out. So it could also reflect, to some extent, this is my Western science hat now coming out. It could also just reflect that the landscape just didn't have a lot of fuel on it to carry fire between 1680 and 1730, and then was just started getting fires again after that. Based on what we know about village sites, it seems like that 1736 is an important pivot point, at least within Voyageurs National Park, but it seems to be reflected also in the boundary waters in terms of when people were living on the landscape along the border. So I don't know if that was someone talking on the mic.
That was good.
Okay.
Time for one more question.
Sure, I have one. And then maybe this will be can any of this be related to climate change, or do you see any type of minor occurrences because of climate change? Climate change is a fairly recent term. So,
Yeah.
And Kurt, would you repeat the question, please?
So the question is can any of this be related to climate change? Climate change is a relatively recent phenomenon, but can we look at this with respect to climate change? And I think, am I paraphrasing that okay?
yes.
Yeah, and I guess I'm gonna answer the question in this way. It's really hard to use the 20th century as a benchmark for anything when it comes to fire. because we've done such a good job of removing people from the landscape and basically removing the ignition source. We've also done such a good job of putting fires out when they start, human or light, right? So it's hard to use the 20th century as a benchmark. But you can look at climate variation back in time in the sense of how frequent fires were with respect to climate patterns. With the stuff that we've looked at, the data that we've looked at, and this is largely driven by the boundary waters, there's not really like a periodicity, or there's not like sets. The 1860s, the 1863, 64, 65, super warm, super dry for a period of years, everything probably burned. Somewhere there's 1864, 65 fire somewhere up there. So you can, I guess in some ways, I look at that 1863, 64, 65 event, and that makes me worry about the present, right? Because we know that when we had warm, dry conditions, and 1804 too. 1804 doesn't show up as much, it doesn't like stand out, 1739 does. But we know that we have big fires and we get hot, warm, dry conditions. Right now, I look at the landscape as being a lot different than it was in 1864, 65. So if it's hot, dry, and the summers are hot and dry, and we get a fire with a little bit of wind, there's a lot of fuel up there at this point. So.
All right, let's thank Rick for a great job. Like just a couple of quick remarks to close things out. So this is the final seminar in our spring semester from the Department of Forest Resources. I have been remiss in failing to acknowledge our committee, but Ryan Murphy is the guy who has coordinated the broadcasts for the most part. It's right here in Green Hall. Thank you, Ryan, for doing that. Rebecca Montgomery, Ben Finley, and Ella Gray, and I are the rest of the Forest Resources Department Seminar Committee. We are really excited about all of you having been here, and all of you who tuned in online. It's been nice. We debated a lot, do these seminars happen in person or online? How do we do this? And appreciate your all kind of bearing with us and coming along for the ride. We had 3 really good seminars this semester. We're excited. I'm excited to see what comes next semester as we get back into this in the fall. Thanks everyone for participating. Thanks again for a terrific talk. Have a good afternoon, everyone.